Hey guys, welcome back to Turn Your Lights On. It's Halloween week, so I wanted to create an episode for you guys that I thought would really give in to the eeriness that this week brings. Because there's nothing better than listening to a gory true crime case and walking around outside at night going door to door with your children, siblings, or the little kids you babysit to do the one thing your parents tell you not to do as a kid, which is of course to not take candy from a stranger. But before I fill your head with paranoia, why don't we just hop right in to this week's case? As I'm sure many of you know by now, I'm your host Emily, and before we jump into today's case, I strongly advise you turn your lights on. The murder in this case is the first known Connecticut case that led to the conviction of murder without a body present. However, once you see the evidence, it'll be clear to you why the body wasn't needed for a judge to decide that this was a clear open and closed case. This case would also end up being the first ever episode of a show that I'm certain most of you are familiar with, Forensic Files. Helle Crafts was a 39-year-old flight attendant and attentive mother to her 3 young children. She was born in Denmark in 1947, but moved to Newtown, Connecticut to follow her dreams. Helle was married to Richard Crafts, who was the father of their children. Richard and Helle met at work. While Helle was a flight attendant, Richard was actually a pilot for Eastern Airlines, and at this point, Richard and Helle had been married for about 12 years. But Helle had suspected that her husband had been having an affair for quite some time now. It was the typical signs of adultery that had really raised her suspicions. Even though Richard was a pilot, he had slowly begun to be less of a presence in his own home. He was around less and had often been caught lying about where he was when he wasn't around. And with these suspicions, Helle wanted to make sure she had confirmation and was 100% certain before proceeding with divorce. After speaking with her attorney, Diane Anderson, the two proceeded to find a private investigator to see what information they could find on Richard Crafts. And on a rainy night in the fall of 1986, Helle Crafts met with a private investigator and discovered something that would change the trajectory of her marriage entirely. Helle was handed over the gut-wrenching evidence of her husband having an affair with another woman. This clear-as-day evidence seemed to be what really pushed Helle over the edge. After all, Richard had not been a very good husband to her from the get-go. Allegedly, some of Helle's friends and family had claimed that Richard would even go as far as physically harming Helle from time to time. At this point, Helle decides to proceed with filing for divorce, which is extremely brave of her considering the fact that, again, this is the 1900s and divorce wasn't a common thing at the time. And with Richard's known anger that he would direct towards Helle, she confided in her work friends, even going as far as telling one of her coworkers that if anything were to happen to her, it was most likely her husband Richard. And sure enough, shortly after this encounter with the private investigator, Helle went missing and would never return. On November 18th, 1986, one of Helle's coworkers would drop her off at her home after work, and this would be the last known sighting of Helle Crafts. A few days had since gone by since Helle was dropped off from her last flight assignment by her friend. And when the time came and gone for her next assignment, Helle didn't show. She didn't even bother to call. And this raised red flags immediately. Helle was very good friends with most of her coworkers, and they knew that this was very out of character for her. So being the good friends they were, they decided to call the Crafts home to check in. Except every call made to the Crafts home had been intercepted by Richard, and with every call he had a new excuse as to why Helle wasn't around. And when Helle's friends began to talk, they noticed that with every call there was a new story, but somehow none of them added up. Panic quickly ensued amongst the group of friends, especially with their most recent conversations with Helle. They didn't waste any time before getting into contact with Helle's attorney and sharing with her that Helle had gone missing. Diane knew that this was very odd behavior, not only because of the statements Helle had recently made about fearing her husband, but because none of Richard's stories added up, and Helle was a very attentive mother. She wouldn't just up and leave her 3 young children. So Diane did what she thought was best and contacted the investigator who helped investigate Richard and his infidelity. The private investigator and Diane determined that they should go to the Newtown Police Department to report Helle as a missing person. Unfortunately, nothing came of this accusation, so the private investigator, Keith Mayo, decided to conduct his own investigation. And honestly, the biggest help during this investigation was Richard and Helle's nanny. She told Keith that the morning after Helle had returned home from her European flight assignment at around 6 a.m., Richard had woken her and the kids. He helped them get ready and brought the 3 kids and the nanny to his sister's home because the Crafts' home had lost power, according to Richard. Now, Helle hadn't joined them on their trip to Richard's sister's home, which of course was questioned by both the children and the nanny, concerned as to where she was. But Richard assured them that Helle would be joining them shortly. Keith and Diane actually learned that even after 2 weeks of Helle being missing, not once had Richard reported her as missing. The only thing Richard had done during this time was come up with excuse after excuse as to why Helle wasn't at work or why she hadn't joined her family at his sister's home. And once the nanny was being investigated, she made sure to include whatever details she could about the Crafts. She had shared with Keith that there was a giant stain on the Crafts carpet that she had noticed after she and the kids had returned from his sister's home, one that hadn't been there before.
In this home video, the Crafts' live-in nanny talks about some mysterious dark stain she noticed on the carpet shortly after Helle disappeared.
And the inside of the bedroom door was a spot, a black spot?
Yeah.
How big would you say it was?
Half this big.
How, about that big?
Yeah.
Did it look like a stain?
It looked like it was stained, but it hadn't been there before.
She also shared that not long after she noticed the stain, which was located in Helle and Richard's bedroom, that Richard had actually decided to rip up the carpet on the flooring. However, the ripped up carpet wasn't the only odd thing that had happened while they were gone. A rather large freezer had gone missing from the garage at the time as well. Some sources say that Richard claims that once he dropped the nanny and his 3 children off at his sister's home, that he had not left his house until they returned. But credit card receipts showed a very different story. At the time of Richard's wife's disappearance, he had rented a WoodChipper and new bedding. This is where things become pretty apparent to the public that Helle had gone missing and that her husband was acting pretty erratically. Once this information becomes public, a snowplow driver named Joseph Hine makes a statement that would really help determine the fate of this case. He claims that at 3 a.m. on November 20th, he saw a man on the bridge of the Housatonic River. And this man was doing something that most typically don't do in the middle of winter at 3 a.m. on a bridge. This man was lugging around a diesel-powered wood chipper. And with all this crucial evidence, Keith is able to finally get police on board with the investigation. How could he not have? At this point, Helle had been missing for weeks. There was a carpet stained with a rather large dark spot that looked eerily like blood that was ripped from the home. A freezer was missing from the Crafts' garage. Richard had purchased a wood chipper and potentially spotted with a wood chipper on a bridge on the Housatonic River. What more evidence could they need? Richard was immediately brought in to be questioned by police and was subjected to a polygraph test. And he passes. Not only does he pass, but he also shows little to no emotion when he's being questioned by police. Since authorities aren't able to get any further information out of Richard at this time, they decide to call in forensic expert Dr. Henry Lee. Dr. Henry Lee joins in on the investigation and does a walkthrough of the Crafts' home with authorities. Not long into the investigation, Lee finds not one, not two, but 5 bloodstains on Richard and Helle's mattress. Police immediately test these bloodstains and are able to determine that they do in fact match Helle Crafts. Not only were they able to conclude that the bloodstains belonged to Helle, but they were able to determine that these bloodstains had been from some sort of injury that she had endured, as opposed to her menstrual cycle. Now, I never took criminal justice classes in school, so I was curious as to how police were able to determine this, and I was absolutely blown away by the amount of testing that can be done to determine this. Henry Lee was also able to determine at which angle he believed Helle to have been attacked from. According to Dr. Lee's book, Cracking Cases, The Science of Solving Crimes, he states, quote, "I was able to deduce that Helle Crafts must have been kneeling down or stooping over at the foot of her bed when she was attacked, probably from behind. She had not been lying down when she was murdered. It's possible Helle was changing the sheets on the bed when her husband attacked and killed her." End quote. Dr. Lee was even able to go as far as to test some of the towels in the home. From there, he was able to discover that even though they had since been cleaned, there had been a handful of towels that were once covered in blood. Their next order of business was to visit the Housatonic River Bridge, where Joseph Hine had seen a man with a wood chipper early in the morning of November 20th. They came across a pile of wood chips alongside the river, which would match that of ones that had gone through a wood chipper. But they also find a shredded piece of envelope that was addressed to Helle Crafts. And now all the pieces of the puzzle are slowly falling into place. Immediately after this discovery, police began investigating the area. This investigation lasts days, but it proves to be worthy of their time. Authorities were able to find 2,660 pieces of blonde hair, small bone fragments, teeth, and a fingernail. And with this evidence, they decide to continue their investigation. And once the snow melts, they dive into the river only to find a piece of a chainsaw. Now, this chainsaw was unidentifiable because the serial number had been tampered with, so they weren't able to trace it, or so one would think. Police were actually able to use a chemical on the chainsaw that helped wither away the most superficial layers. And once these outermost layers had been scraped off, they were able to once again see the serial number. Police also used the hair fibers that were found at the river to conclude that they had in fact belonged to Helle Crafts. However, one test that really stood out was on the fingernail that they had found. Authorities were able to compare the nail polish that was found on the fingernail to the nail polish that was at the Crafts' home. And to nobody's surprise, they matched. Unfortunately, even with all this evidence, police could only determine that Helle had been injured by this wood chipper. Without a body, there was still no way to prove that she was dead. So they conducted 2 final tests. Police took the wood chipper that Richard had rented and used pig bones to reenact what they thought may have happened to Helle. And sure enough, the divots left in the pig bones matched the fragments of the bones that they had found. After they were able to determine that the wood chipper had definitely been the cause of the damage to the bones, they needed to be sure that the wood chipper had been the cause of Helle's death, and if not, where she was, because she would be very clearly injured at this point. After the experiment with the pig bones, officers did one final test to determine that the bone fragments they found had in fact belonged to Helle's skull. And with this crucial evidence, police were able to determine that Helle Crafts had been killed. This was enough evidence for police to take Richard into custody. From there, Richard was seen being led into the Superior Court in Danbury for a bond hearing on January 20th, 1987. The result of this being that the court refused to reduce his bond of $750,000. Richard Crafts was then originally tried in May of 1988, but unfortunately resulted in a mistrial after a juror refused to convict him. Richard was then retried in 1990, where he was sentenced to 50 years in prison after a judge had seen his lack of remorse for what he had done. Richard has since been released at the age of 82 as of 2020 after serving 32 years of his 50-year sentence. Richard has since moved to the Isaiah House for Homeless Veterans, which is the most current information I could find on this case. And that's the case of Helle Crafts and the WoodChipper murder. This case made headlines in its time for not only how gruesome and remorseless Richard Crafts was, but because this was the very first case in Connecticut that a conviction was made without the victim's body. With all the evidence that was presented in this case, I feel that it's pretty clear why it was so open and shut. But unfortunately, that's all I have for you guys this week. Thank you for tuning in, and for all you trick-or-treaters and chaperones out there, stay safe and enjoy this very spooky holiday. The frights won't stop here, so tune in next week for another case that will be sure to make you want to turn your lights on.